Now let's look briefly at this whole question of boat people. Now, it's true, under the Howard government, there was a much more rigorous policy of ensuring that people who came to this country illegally, without going through proper channels, were going to be denied access to Australia. And they were detained, first of all, in places like Christmas Island, and in more recent times in places like Nauru. Now, no one likes the idea of putting people in detention. No one likes it. It's a terrible thing. And yet we all accept that in cases of breach of the criminal law, that might be something that needs to happen. Now, I'm not for a second suggesting that boat people were in breach of the criminal law. That's not the case. They were entering Australia illegally in accordance with Australian law, but they certainly weren't committing a criminal offence. Nevertheless, given the way people living in difficult circumstances feel, and given the magnet that a place like Australia is to people under those circumstances, if we hadn't done what we did, there is no doubt that the boats would have kept coming, and there is no doubt that there would have been more tragedies like that befell that vessel in late 2004, which sunk in the Timor Sea with the loss of some 300 lives. So it was a tough policy, a very tough policy, but nevertheless it did stop these boats coming, and as a result of stopping the boats coming, it did stop the people drowning, and that surely is something to place in the scales of justice when you are judging the performance of a government. The final point I want to talk about is the Iraq War. Now, again, no one would want to see the armed forces of their country committed to combat. But what is the point of having an armed force if it isn't from time to time deployed in what is a good cause? Now, Saddam Hussein and his government were in material breach of what was supposed to be binding United Nations resolutions. Saddam Hussein was, by any standards, a monster who had horrifically persecuted his own people and had unleashed aggressive war on the people of his region. Now, as a result of the war in which Australia participated and which the Howard government very importantly supported, Saddam Hussein is no more. Now, it would be obviously, undeniably, gilding the lily to suggest that everything in post-war Iraq has been rosy. Of course it hasn't. There have been horrific problems in post-war Iraq, and yet ever since that war, it has been the so-called invaders, the Americans, the British, and to a much lesser extent the Australians, who have been trying to rebuild the country, and it's been our enemies, the Islamists, the separatists, the jihadists, who have been blowing people up and creating the mayhem. Now, I don't say that everyone with the wisdom of hindsight would say that we should have done what we did, but I do say that we were morally entitled, based on what we knew then, to do what we did. And I would also say that at all times the government has had the best interests of the Iraqi people at heart, and not only had their interests at heart, but has been prepared to support that commitment to the Iraqi people with an enormous amount of money and the support of the Australian Armed Forces. While I said earlier that God and Caesar are not hand in glove, so to speak, Caesar and ethics should be well known to each other. A government should not operate in accordance with explicit religious principles in a country like Australia, but it certainly should try to operate in accordance with good ethical standards. And I think that for all the inevitable mistakes that it made, for all the things that people might with goodwill question, the Howard government did try to operate in accordance with ethical standards. It's difficult sometimes for people, particularly Christian people, to look at what governments do and to feel comfortable about it. For instance, how could a good, compassionate Christian feel comfortable about government rules which say that if you don't work for the dole, you should lose it? Or to feel comfortable about government rules that say if you turn up at this country without a visa, you get detained? Or to look at government rules that say, well, if you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, you're liable to be coerced or even shot by members of the police or the armed forces. And if I may say so, this is the difference between the morality of a private citizen and the ethics of a government. What is right or what is best for an individual is not necessarily right or best for a government. Jesus, as you would remember, said to the rich young man, if you would be perfect, go, sell all you have, give it to the poor and follow me. And we all know that the rich young man didn't want to do that and went away sad. Yes, it would be the highest Christian virtue for an individual human being to give up all his or her worldly possessions and follow the Lord. But that doesn't mean that it's right for a government to say, well, all of our taxation revenue should be given to social security. Because if you do that, you're going to have a lot more people who aren't working and a lot fewer people who are working. And what is Christian virtue, heroic Christian virtue in an individual, might actually be the height of folly. No virtue whatsoever, but the deepest vice in a government. And I think this distinction is not always easy for good people, particularly good Christian people, to grasp. And yet I think it's absolutely at the heart of any proper understanding of what is and what is not truly ethical for politicians. So, look, I think gatherings like this are best if they have short speeches and long sessions for questions and answers. I want to say again, John, to you and your team, thank you very much for organising this and thank you very much for having me. As you rightly said, I don't put myself on any particular pedestal when it comes to the faith. I am as sinful as the next person. I am as prone to error and folly as the next person. But I do take it seriously, for better or for worse, to the extent of my own imperfections and defects of insight and will. And I do think that for all my faults, they'd be infinitely worse if I didn't have at least some form of Christian faith to sustain me. So thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. Let's have a lively and vigorous discussion for the rest of the evening.
Okay, so Tony's happy to take questions on what he's just spoken about and even off the topic a bit if you've got any. Just a couple of rules. Because this event is aimed at young adults, I'll only be taking questions. I'll only ask you to ask a question if you fit that bill. So I'm sorry to those people, but that's what the event's for. And you know, we want to hear questions. We don't want to hear speeches. So if you want to make a speech, there's a soapbox just on the corner outside where you can. You're welcome to get up. Yeah, they're the only two rules. So.